Hello there, dear friends, and welcome to another spooky season true crime story. Yes, special themed stories this month. You're supposed to guess the theme. If you saw my last video, you already know what's up. And if you didn't and you are new, hi, my name is Rachel, and you can come here to hear about interesting true crime stuff. So yeah, today's story comes to us from the annals of history. It is kind of bizarre. It involves pirates or a pirate. And yeah, let's not waste any more time. Roll the disclaimer. All right, you've been warned. So, pirates. Yes, who doesn't love a good pirate story? Swashbuckling, peg-legged buccaneers searching for booty out on the high seas. From Robert Louis Stevenson's epic tale, Treasure Island, to Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean, these colorful characters like Long John Silver and Jack Sparrow capture our imaginations and, dare I say, our hearts. The subject of today's story is nothing like any of that. Joseph Kerwin was the first and only man convicted of piracy in the state of Michigan. And his crimes took place not on the vast, boundless ocean, but on Lake Erie. And though he is often called the last pirate, there is a chance you might know him by his other name, the Erie Strangler. Just a side note, there is also an astronaut named Joseph Kerwin. This story is not about him. So our Joe grew up on the mean streets of Toledo, Ohio at the end of the 19th century. That's the late 1800s. For those of you who get confused by that stuff, I know I do sometimes. At the time, the city had become one of the largest in Ohio. Industry was booming, and with that industry came droves of immigrants ready to work. This great influx of Toledo residents was made possible because Toledo was a major rail hub, second only to Chicago in the number of railways coming into the city. Between 1860 and 1900, the population swelled in size more than 10 times, from around 13,000 residents to 130,000 souls. And as always, when you have this massive growth of population and industry, you also have a massive growth of wealth, but also poverty and crime. And this is the environment that young Joe Kerwin was raised in. And although it was like a lot of years ago, and there's not a huge amount of information about his childhood, one journalist who was reporting about him after his crimes described him as a product of the gutter, and so by this we can assume that he was not rubbing elbows with Toledo's upper crust. And Joe was a bit of an eager beaver when it came to his criminal history. He started pretty early at age 14 when he strangled a young girl, not to death. The killing would come later. And for this, he landed himself in a boys' reform school for a while. We all know how lovely and pleasant the boys' reform schools of the late 1800s were. He probably got 3 square meals a day and was hardly ever beaten at all. After he was released from that reform school, he ended up moving to Illinois, where he unfortunately did strangle another girl, and this time he got sent to prison. He served that 4-year sentence, which honestly seems a little light for strangling somebody. I mean, again, it wasn't to death, but we shouldn't be doing that at all. And I don't know if 4 years is really enough time. But anyway, after he got out of that Illinois prison, he moved back to Ohio, but this time not to Toledo, but to Cleveland. And finally, in Cleveland, Ohio, is where he stopped strangling women. Just kidding. That's not what happened, obviously, or I wouldn't have a story to tell you. In Cleveland, he actually began to escalate the strangulations to murder, allegedly. And let me tell you why I have to say allegedly. The Cleveland police were looking for a perpetrator who was known only as Joe the Strangler. And he was wanted for a string of crimes against the local sex workers. The first victim was a woman named Maggie Snedeker, who was found on February 13th, 1903, in the room in the brothel where she worked, strangled to death and apparently robbed. About 10 days after that, two other women, Helen Morris and Belle Anderson, came forward to the police to describe a very similar crime happening to each of them. They had both been first strangled and then robbed. Obviously not strangled to death, right? Dead people can't make police reports. Because of the similarity between both the victims and the modus operandi, the police did believe that all three women had been victimized by the same person. Along with the info they got from the two surviving women, they also got some details from an eyewitness, and all of this information together led them to the door of Joe Kerwin. Old Sneaky Joe was then sort of searched for evidence, and on him they found a watch that had belonged to Maggie Snedeker. This was enough for them to make an arrest. Unfortunately, they just couldn't seem to make any charges stick. Apparently, there was just not enough evidence. I guess the testimony of two surviving victims and an eyewitness and the dead woman's pocket watch being on his person just wasn't quite enough. Now, this is 1903. Okay, there's basically no such thing as real forensic evidence as we know it today. So I ask you, what exactly would have been enough evidence to charge him? What more could they possibly have asked for? And I'm about to go on a little bit of a rant here, but I have to wonder if the chosen profession of the victims has anything to do with why Joe was let go. And honestly, I get a little sick of it when I read story after story, time and time again, of these guys who target sex workers and constantly get away with it. This was 1903, 1904. It was happening then. And quite frankly, it's not that much different today. I just think that we could be doing a little bit better. And that's all I have to say about that. I'm going to get down off of my soapbox now. But yeah, food for thought. We're moving on now. So when Joe was initially arrested in Cleveland, this made big news all over Ohio. And naturally, the authorities in Toledo, remember, that's where Joe used to live. That's where he grew up. And police in Toledo made some connections between the crimes that Joe was being accused of in Cleveland and an unsolved murder case that they had of a woman named Anna Snyder, who had also been strangled to death and robbed, and was also a sex worker. Since her case had not been solved, and they believed that this happened to her during the time that Joe was residing in Toledo, they obviously kind of liked him for this murder. But unfortunately, they looked into it, and you're not going to believe this. They didn't find enough evidence for an arrest warrant. Surprise. So, just like in Cleveland, Joe would again escape justice, allegedly. Now, I know what you're thinking. Rachel, you promised us pirates. Where are the pirates? And to you, I say, shh, I'm getting to it. We're going to fast forward a little bit to September 13th, 1904. Now we are in the middle of Lake Erie, aboard a boat called the Western States. It's making its way across the water, taking passengers from Buffalo, New York to Detroit, Michigan. In her cabin, Adelia C.B. Sweeting, a woman I could find no information about outside of the context of this case, except that she was wealthy and she was from Jackson, Michigan, was blissfully asleep. That is, until she felt the firm grasp of two hands wrapped around her neck. As she opened her eyes, she found she was staring right into the face of her attacker, who began to squeeze more tightly until all the blood vessels in her eyes began to pop, and she eventually lost consciousness. As she came to, she found that she had been robbed of 3 gold rings right off her fingers and $40 in cash, which in today's money would be about $1,000, not exactly a small amount of money. She was obviously very confused and frightened, but she did manage to make her way onto the deck of the ship and to flag down a crew member to ask for help. He brought her immediately to the ship's captain. She told the captain her harrowing tale of survival, and the captain decided right then and there that Mrs. Sweeting was obviously having some kind of horrible hallucination, probably brought on by too much drinking, drug use, or like her period or something. But finally, Adelia was able to convince him that the large bruises around her neck were not self-inflicted. And then, mostly convinced, Mr. Buttface Captain decided not to dock in Detroit so that they could keep everyone on board, and any perpetrator, whoever did this, was obviously still on the boat. They wanted to keep it that way. But he did send a crew member to the land to bring a detective back so they could get to the bottom of this mystery. And that detective was Frank Wilkinson. He arrived on the boat, and he, unlike the stupid captain, actually took the situation very seriously and wasted no time getting down to business. First, of course, he interviewed Adelia, the victim, but unfortunately, even though her face had only been inches from that of her attacker, her cabin had been very dark, and so she wasn't really able to give any detail about what this man looked like. She had a little bit of vague description, but he hadn't said anything to her, so she didn't know what his voice sounded like, and she just had kind of like vague, shadowy shape to go on. Detective Wilkinson then had all the crew members line up and come down to the boiler room, where he started doing a little bit of interrogation, one by one, of everyone on the ship. At one point, he gets to this shifty-looking oiler, was his job description. It's just like a guy who keeps all the machine parts greased up. And when questioned, this guy was kind of nervous and fidgety. You know, like the way that somebody acts when they did something bad and they're about to get caught. Frank the detective takes note of this, goes ahead and wraps up the rest of the interviews, and then allows for the ship to dock and for everyone to disembark. Unknown to this suspect shipmate, Frank Wilkinson was hot on his heels, tailing the man all the way to his home on Antoine Street, a home that he shared with his wife and child. Upon conducting a search of the home, Wilkinson found Adelia's 3 gold rings. And who was this suspect in question? It was Mr. Joseph Kerwin. I know. Are you surprised? You shouldn't be that surprised. I think it was pretty obvious. Anyway, Joe was taken out in handcuffs right then and there in front of his wife and everybody. Now here's the thing. Joe really messed up this time. See, that ship, the Western States, it was 17 miles offshore when he attacked Adelia Sweeting. And in 1904, the law of the land only extended 3 nautical miles into the water. Beyond that, and a person was subject to maritime laws. And in this case, what that meant was that instead of being charged with assault and grand larceny, Joe was going to be charged with robbery on the high seas, which is piracy. That's what piracy is. And it also moved the case out of the state court and into federal jurisdiction. Okay, so big deal, right? Like, what's the difference? Well, let me tell you what the difference is. If he had committed this crime on land in Detroit, his penalty would likely have been 5 years in prison. The federal penalty for piracy was death. Wow, Rachel, that's a really big difference. I know. But you know what they say about committing assault and grand larceny. Location, location, location. This charge was completely unprecedented. I guess no one had ever committed a crime like this quite this far away from shore. And it was obvious to everyone, including Judge Henry Swan, who was overseeing the case, that federal piracy laws weren't really intended to be used for crimes committed on lakes, even really big ones like the Great Lakes. So when Kerwin decided not to put up a defense and instead just plead guilty to the crimes, Judge Swan kind of took mercy on him. He was able to find a kind of legal workaround that allowed him to charge Joe under Michigan law instead of federal law, meaning that he was able to sentence Joe to life in prison instead of sending him to the gallows. Still a lot more than the 5 years he would have gotten otherwise, but considering he maybe allegedly also killed 2 women that he kind of allegedly maybe got away with, I feel like life is probably a fair sentence. And with that, not-so-peg-leg Joe was sent to the Detroit Institute of Corrections, where he had a very bad time. He apparently was giving his jailers all kinds of trouble, causing all kinds of problems, and just generally not adjusting very well. But he would only be in that institution for about 7 years, and then he was transferred to Leavenworth. Yes, the infamous Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And there, Joe was having a great time. He thrived. And I feel like we see this kind of commonly, especially with people who are sort of compulsively antisocial. Sometimes they get in prison and they're like, this is it. This is my life. It's like they need the imprisonment. They need that like heavy structure. But Leavenworth actually was not as high security as the Detroit Penitentiary had been. In Leavenworth, he was able to kind of do all kinds of things he could have been doing on the outside. He learned to play the trombone. He learned civil engineering through a correspondence course. He also became the editor-in-chief of the Leavenworth newspaper, which was called The New Era. Someone he had worked with at that prison paper actually later on sort of sang his praises and gave a quote saying, I'm going to read this directly, "Joe is talented. He has for a long time been recognized as the institution's poet laureate. He was a leader in prison athletics and a star of the baseball diamond. When holiday shows of local talent were the order of the day, Joe took a leading part as impresario and actor. His singing and acting contributed much to the success of many holiday minstrel and vaudeville entertainments." Now that is quite an endorsement. Kerwin had many friends and relatives who were constantly petitioning for his release, feeling that life in prison was far too much for the crime that he had committed. But federal prosecutors really didn't want to hear about any kind of early release, because remember, he was still really the only person that had ever been suspected in the murders of Maggie Snedeker and Anna Snyder. So they really didn't think that he should be let go, because they perceived him as being incredibly dangerous. They were probably right. But in this country, you cannot convict somebody because of like a hunch you have or because you suspect them. Ideally, you are, in fact, innocent until you're proven guilty. He had not been proven guilty in either of those cases. And so people continued to petition to have him let go early or be granted clemency. In fact, these petitions for clemency had reached the desks of both President Wilson and President Harding, although neither of them actually saw fit to grant him a pardon. Despite this, Joe Kerwin was eventually able to secure a release on parole in 1926. And he walked out into the world, the only inland pirate in existence. Of course, the newspapers went nuts for this story, as did I when I heard about it, because it's just so bizarre and interesting. And because it was so heavily covered by the papers, all the people that had been pulling for Joe could read about what a model prisoner he was and how he had completely reformed his life and was a changed person. All of his supporters were just elated that he was finally free from his unjust and unwarranted sentence. That is, until they all had to eat a big slice of humble pie when Joe was caught in the act of yet another robbery and again arrested. He was sent immediately right back to Leavenworth, where he stayed until his death in 1943. So once a pirate, always a pirate, I guess, even if only by geographic technicality. And that is the story of the last pirate, Joe Kerwin. That's what I've got for you. I hope that you thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it so very fascinating. I love these old cases so much. And I think that this story played in perfectly with my Halloween true crime theme. Thank you so very much for watching today. I really appreciate you being here. And thank you guys for 500 subscribers. That's absolutely mind-blowingly amazing. I will see you guys on the next one. Until then, please do something to take care of yourself today and every day. I've been struggling this month. I don't know if anybody else has, but man, it has been a struggle bus this month, which is why my content is not coming out as quickly as I would like it to. We may be pushing Halloween content into November, which quite frankly I'm fine with. We can push it all the way to Thanksgiving Day, as far as I'm concerned, which from now on I will be celebrating as Halloween Part 2, the Stuffing. Anyway, I love you, and I will see you later. Bye.